Chapter 20, The Secret Pass, from Sheriff at Waterstop. Another night and a fruitless day passed at the foot of the great mountains. No posse coming from behind and no sign of the outlaws ahead, nor any sign of the pass either, Brett thought, irritated with the calmness of Joseph and Pa as they patiently searched through the myriad of stubborn rocky spurs and false ravines, looking for something Joseph could recognize. 2 days in the saddle wore Pa out, and he rode with a hand to his side, but said nothing about the pain. And nobody said anything about being hungry. But Brett thought a lot about it. Even at night, there was no sign of anything. No telltale smoke or fire's glow. The afternoon was on the wane on the second day when Joseph came riding out from behind a stand of trees. A path! I think I found it! Pa and Brett were too tired to say anything. They only followed hard after him past the trees, across a brook that still had some water in it, and down into deep ravine. It looked doubtful to Brett, a deep gap in the earth, widening until it terminated at a granite wall. This wall rose up maybe 50 feet above the ground. It was the end of a spur off a larger mountain. Nevertheless, they rode down to the face of the rock, and just as Brett was about to rein in with disgust, he saw the abrupt turn-off behind a stack of rocks. The small pile of rocks itself was a giveaway. They had been piled in too orderly a way to be a work of nature. Man had done it. It was a landmark, a signal to someone that the route lay this way. He called this the staircase, Joseph said, still excited. See how it climbs into a steep part of the mountain? Come on. In single file, the horses walked up the steep path that corkscrewed along the mountain on one side and was sheltered by trees on the other. At last, they came out into the open, much higher up than they had been. Brett could see the tops of other mountains in the distance, though he knew he was on the mere kneecap of this one. The path leveled out, and they followed over grassy places and then down a ridge again. All this while the afternoon was dying away. In places where there was rock or trees on the west side, they rode in twilight. They would emerge into daylight in clear places. It was in the light that Pa stopped suddenly and pointed to a softer place where water had run off recently from a rainstorm. Look. It was a single hoof print, cast firmly in the mud and not more than 2 days old. Gradually, the pass widened out. The ground became pretty level when they went to the feet of the mountains again. Now they were among the mountains instead of lingering on their skirts. Decent daylight was cut off. Though the sky was way above was still pale blue, shades of deep blue, violet, and gray had fallen among the ridges. Gullies, ravines, and on the path itself, shadows cast by the trees or an early night thrown down from the mountains themselves. They rode up between the high rock walls on either side until they came out again at a level place. The trail ahead of them went upwards into trees, and along their right side another steep slope ran up the mountain. To their left, the downward slope was more gradual, dipping down through several patches of trees, and then ending in a sheer cliff. The slopes and ridges above were pretty, but Brett didn't hanker for a climb in the twilight. Pa reined in. Let's stop where it's level for a space and we've got some shelter. No fire again, I'm afraid. It was a dry camp again, with only jerked beef and hard biscuit to eat, and not much of that, this late into the search. Lying on his back, Brett watched the starry sky. He wondered where the posse was. Could they even depend on the posse now? It had been hard enough for them to get back on the right track, and that was only because Pa had made the correct assumption that the outlaws would head for this pass so far to the south. What if the posse figured they went north to an easier pass? Even if the posse did guess right, it would be hard for them to find the pass itself. It had taken Pa and Joseph 2 days, and Joseph had been this way once before. Shh, boys. It was Pa. Brett sat up. Joseph was sitting too, looking at Pa. Pa gestured upward to where one of the many ridges rose above them. Brett looked up, scanning the rock in the sky. When he saw it, he jumped a little bit. A glow, regular and steady, shining like a yellow star. It was not a fire, but a lamp. A lamplight in a glass chimney that had been set too close to a window. That's them above us, Pa whispered. The must figure we lost them bad. They ain't keeping watch, or they'd have shot us by now. Why didn't we see their cabin? Brett whispered. Trees, Joseph whispered. Their shack is surrounded by trees, but the lamplight is still visible. Like a beacon, Pa added. Come on. The Lord's protected us in our ignorance, but we better get under good cover with the horses. They stood up and silently gathered their camp things together. In a few minutes they had led the horses further down the way they had come, behind a stand of trees. They hobbled the horses again and sank down in different places behind the trees. Up ahead and above was the cabin. To the right was the path and a high tree-covered slope. To the left of the stand of trees, the ground sloped down and then abruptly dropped off in a cliff. First watch, Brett, Pa called over in a whisper. Sure, Pa. Down here, lower on the ridge, they couldn't see the lamplight anymore, but Brett stretched out on his stomach behind a tree with the blanket bundled up under his chest so he could lean his elbows on it and watch for intruders. Now what? He asked himself. Nobody knew where the posse was, and that meant the posse sure didn't know where they were. And there were at least 6 outlaws to the band of 3 trackers. Yet Pa must bring the robbers to justice. Maybe he would send somebody back to find the posse, or maybe he'd think of some way to trick the outlaws into surrender. For the first time in 2 days, he thought about Ma. If something happened to Pa or himself, or to both of them, who would take care of Ma? Now he understood why Pa didn't think it was easy for a married man to be a sheriff. It was hard on the women folk, all right. And that ends Chapter 20. Chapter 21. Pen down. Bullets rattled and kicked up the dust in a neat half-circle around the saddle under Pa's head. At the very first shot, Brett had rolled down around the roots of the aspens around him and drawn his 6-shooter. Pa leaped clear while a bullet kicked right between his heels. 2 of the horses neighed and tried to break off their hobbles. They fell and rolled, screaming in the terrible way that only horses can scream. Hunched under the boughs of a massive pine, Pa deftly reached out into the danger area and snaked his rifle out of the sheath where it lay alongside the saddle. Joseph, already in a low furrow of the ground, and protected by big heavy roots, had his 6th gun in his hand. The shots weren't coming from the cabin, but from the other side of them, raining down from the slope above on the other side of the path. The evening before, the slope had seemed nothing more dangerous than a place where water would run off in a storm. But now, Brett saw it for what it really was, a vantage point. Behind the outlaws' cabin where men could station themselves and hail down gunshot or even rocks on enemies coming up the pass. The terrain on Brett's side of the pass sloped gradually down but stopped sharply with a sheer drop-off farther down. No escape there. The truth hit Brett all of a sudden. They were trapped. High ground in front of them and an eventual drop-off behind them, and 2 of them had nothing more than handguns to fight a pitched battle. Suddenly, everything was reversed. They were no longer in pursuit, but were pursued. Pa drew out his 6th gun and laid the rifle aside. Brett guessed the plan. Try to make them think they had no rifles, get them to close in. After a minute, another volley of shots made them keep their heads down. Brett saw one of the attackers bob up more boldly and shoot with the rifle. Boys, you watch the path to the cabin, Pa ordered. Don't let them take us on the flank. Right, Pa. Brett turned his attention to the way that they had retraced the night before. Almost as Pa feared, a new volley of bullets hailed down from there and ricocheted among the trees, among the rocks. It's the ricochets that might do us in, Pa mumbled. The one man he had sighted took the trouble to take a more deliberate aim at the horses. Pa snatched up the rifle, and just as the outlaw fired, Pa fired. One less, Pa said grimly. But he put my horse away. One man by the cabin path would leap up, fire off a shot, drop down, and then reappear at a different spot and fire. That's an Indian trick, ain't it? Brett asked Joseph. There was no answer, and Brett glanced over. Joseph was gone. Pa. But then he caught himself. There was nothing Pa could do. Joseph had left his gun belt and a .45 in easy reach of Brett. Brett took up the spare gun. Then he saw Joseph. The blonde had popped up behind a tree much farther. Behind the man was so determinedly stalking down toward Brett with the rifle. Indian fighting. Feller, you picked the wrong boy to play Indians with, Brett murmured. You're taking on the real thing. In another instant, the outlaw's head and gun popped up again, but before he got a shot off, there was a blur of Joseph's knife, and then Joseph himself darted across the path and leaped atop the fallen man. They spilled out onto the path, both pitifully exposed to gunfire from either side, and then they rolled against a tree on the near side of the path and sheltered them from above. The outlaw, bigger, older, more murderous than Joseph, had been hit in the shoulder by the knife. There was blood drawn down his back and on his arm as he wrestled with Joseph for the rifle. He freed his bad arm to cuff Joseph's face, and though the blow landed, Joseph didn't flinch, but rather yanked the rifle away with a sweep and used it as a club in those close quarters to knock the man down. Then he disappeared over the edge of the slope on Brett's side. A few minutes later, he came puffing up the steep slope from behind the stand of trees and rejoined his friends. 2 rifles, Sheriff. Pa glanced at him. Where'd you... But gunfire made him turn back. That fellow still alive? Brett asked. Plenty alive. Joseph ruefully rubbed his jaw. Just unarmed and very angry. Your guy would not want me to kill him unless I had to. You're right. He wouldn't. But the man cannot fight anymore. Now it is 4 of them against the 3 of us. Better, eh? Joseph asked. Better. Pa agreed, except we're sitting here in a trap. They've still got a king-size upper hand judging from the point of view strategy. We're pinned down and they're sitting pretty. If only one of us could get up that slope behind them, Brett wished. He could even the odds up there. Don't seem possible, Pa said. There's no covered way to get up there from here. Well, maybe we could hold them off until help comes, Brett suggested. Or maybe we could trick them into doing something foolish. Posse might come, Joseph added. If they're close enough to hear the shots, Brett agreed. But in his heart, he knew how remote those chances were. The posse could be anywhere. We've got to pray that if the posse does come, they don't rush into gunfire, Pa added. That path is mighty exposed, and some of the men will be picked off before they reach cover. Those outlaws are crafty. It's no wonder they didn't care about the lamp in the window. Nobody could come close without them hearing it, and they knew that at first light they would be able to see if anyone was on their trail. Pa looked grim. We got to think of something, boys, and we got to do it before dark comes. And that ends chapter 21.